Hello, I'm Bill Haney. Let's have a conversation. Today we'll be talking with Jack Lessenberry. Jack is someone who has long been known as an authoritative commentator on the many important issues facing us, whether national or state or local. As a journalist, he's won many awards and worn many hats. He's a prolific writer. His work has appeared in many national publications and regional publications, as well as in Michigan, including Vanity Fair, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. He's had his hand in several books before the one we'll focus on today. He co-authored the very insightful book, The People's Lawyer, The Life and Times of Frank J. Kelly. He was our nation's longest-serving Attorney General. Jack's blog, Lessenberry Inc., is a must-read for his growing list of followers. Now, Jack could illuminate many issues, and he could give us insights into the people who make the news and are influential in our communities in many ways. In fact, we could spend an hour just talking about Ernie Harwell, for example, and perhaps someday we'll do that. But today we'll talk about Jack's newest book. It deals with one of the most urgent issues in our country today, and it's aptly titled Reason versus Racism. And its subtitle tells us what we'll find in its pages: a newspaper family, race, and justice. Jack, welcome. Let's talk about your book. I understand it's just now being released, and this is your first public appearance to talk about it. Is that correct?
That's exactly right, Bill, and it's an honor to have my first public appearance be with you, who knows more about books, and you've brought more books to light, actually helped books be born, more than 400 books than anybody I know. So
I plead guilty.
You're a prolific father, and you certainly helped me with many aspects of the production of this book. I'm honored to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you, and this book focuses really exclusively on one newspaper family. Right. And we've had in America several prominent newspaper families, but the Block family has for over a century been a prominent publisher in Pittsburgh, Toledo, many other places. And you go into the detail deeply on their record of 100 years as a newspaper publishing family and an organization in regard to race relations. So tell me, what's in this book for your readers?
Well, you wonder, why would I care about a newspaper family? I've never even heard of them. Well, because they epitomize how newspapers used to be. Newspapers were owned by families. In the early 100 years ago, almost every newspaper was owned by a family that lived in that town. And in fact, until recently, fairly recently, 30-some years ago, the Detroit News was owned by a family that had always owned it. The Free Press used to be. But this is one of the last remaining newspaper families, along with the Salzburgers, who own the New York Times, the Block family. And it's sort of an all-American story. The original Block, Paul Block I, came over as a 10-year-old Jewish immigrant from Germany. He was born, his family was from Lithuania, running away from anti-Semitism. Came here, got a job as a messenger boy on a newspaper, and eventually became a publisher himself. He sort of helped invent national newspaper advertising, made some money. They had newspapers all over the country. And today, that's dwindled down. The family still has papers in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Toledo, Ohio. They own a lot of broadcast properties as well, and it's still family run. So the third generation of this family, his grandsons, were proud of their racial legacy. They got challenged primarily because of an controversial editorial they wrote in 2018. And the CEO, I've known this family for a long time, asked me if I'd write a book about their racial legacy.
So when did you start on your writing on the book, or did you have to get heavily into research, or had some already been done?
Well, nothing had been done. But what I did is I knew something. I was a journalism professor for a long time. I knew something about the history of the black press and about how white newspapers had treated black people in this country, and essentially, till World War II, they totally ignored them. They ignored black people. There was a thriving black press, just like, you know, there were black baseball leagues. And so there is a separate run of black newspapers and white newspapers. But this family was more progressive than most. I knew that because I knew that they had had a black reporter in Toledo before the New York Times had a full-time black reporter, and they'd had the first black reporter in Pittsburgh. But that's about all I knew. And so I told the CEO, if you want me to do this, I said, I admire your family, but I have to have total freedom. If I find something negative, that's what I want to write. He said, absolutely, you can do that. He said, just make sure the research is thorough. He said, read every paper we ever published. And I was taken aback. I said, Alan, your grandfather owned papers all over the country. Wow. Lancaster, Pennsylvania, had one in Los Angeles, had papers in Milwaukee and Memphis, Tennessee. And he said, yeah, go look at all of them. I said, well, Alan, they're not online. I'd have to go to those towns. He said, yeah, go to those towns, we'll pay for it. Go do the research. And my wife, Elizabeth, is an archivist. So she was a lot of help to me, and we went around and looked at a lot of microfilm at a lot of places, interviewed a lot of people about events closer to the day, and wrote this book. And I think besides a particular, well, the family in itself is interesting. I tried not to make this a dry academic book. It's well researched, but it'd be interesting. It says something about media and race in this country, and about how that sort of all evolved. And this family, I think, has a proud record. It wasn't perfect. They made mistakes. Back in the day, they ignored black people just like everybody else. In Los Angeles in 1931, there was what was called the Colored Air Circus. The black people called it that. It wasn't a pejorative name. They had 40,000 people come and see the first ever exhibition of stunts and things by black pilots at the airport. They didn't cover it. No paper except the African-American papers in California, not the Hearst papers, not the Los Angeles Times, not the Block paper, didn't cover one word of it. But things changed after World War II.
Wow, incredible. So you logged a few miles while doing this.
I'd say I logged a few miles, and I probably put a couple more points on my prescription for eyeglasses from reading microfilm, but it was a fascinating exercise.
And you were able then, and the Block family apparently made good on their commitment to you that they wanted a really journalistic book.
They really did, and I had them read it for accuracy, and one of the family members said, oh, I wish you'd take this out. It wasn't about them, it was about a staff member who had behaved insensitively. They said, nope, I'm not taking it out. And the only real change they suggested, which they were absolutely right, after I got it done, because I was focusing on the newspapers, they said, well, you ought to investigate our broadcast properties too. And I said, you know, you're absolutely right. Wow. And so I took some time investigating their broadcast properties. There actually had been a controversy that I knew about in Toledo about the Cablevision, and so I did all that.
Well, while racial issues and traumas and strife have not been anything new in America, they've been with us for a couple hundred years or more, but your timing turned out to be very fortuitous in that the Black Lives Matter and other very visible incidents in recent years have vaulted this to really a prominence in journalistic coverage now, just as your book comes out.
True, and in fact, there's been some controversy because I don't really deal with that. The idea of the book, it goes from 1900 when the first Paul Block started to be active. In fact, one of his first papers was the old Detroit Journal in Detroit, to 2018 when they had this controversial editorial. And then this summer, of course, there were those protests, and there were some protests in Pittsburgh by people who didn't think they were adequately racially sensitive. But I said, this is a book of history. I don't have time to assess that. If I was writing a book on the French Revolution, I wouldn't write about, or a book about de Gaulle, I wouldn't write about how Emmanuel Macron is doing now. So that was a deliberate cutoff date. I say that in a footnote. And you might have a second edition sometime and look at that. But this is really a work of history, and it's sort of, you know, watch how this paper, it's not a history of just these papers, it's a history of American race relations and how things evolved and what was considered sensitive at one time. And, you know, they put things in the papers back then, even things that were seen as being progressive, that would make your skin crawl today.
Well, it is a book of history and a book of social commentary that's very well and authoritatively documented, but it's more than that too, because I know that some of the reviewers have already commented on it, even the more scholarly academic reviewers. of how readable it is, and of the number of personal anecdotal stories that shed further light on the book.
Well, that means a lot to me because I'm essentially a journalist, not an academician. I wanted a book that people would read.
Yep.
And plus, there's so many entertaining characters in this book, Bill, who I stumbled across. And, you know, we're going to talk about one named Ray Sprigle, but there was also the Blade hired one of the first African-American reporters, the Blade of Toledo, to work for a white newspaper, a man named William Brower in 1946. They sent him after 5 years on a trip around the country to sort of document race relations. They did that again 20 years later, and again 40 years later when he was in his 80s. He worked right up almost until the time he died. So he had more than a 50-year career with this one newspaper.
Fascinating. Sprigle was the man who really went undercover.
Right.
In a very literal way, didn't he?
Sprigle was a character they should make a movie about. Not only was he was one of the greatest investigative reporters of his time. He was based in Pittsburgh. He was also a chicken farmer. And he had two amazing stories. One, not to spoil the book for you, but he was the reporter who won a Pulitzer Prize for finding out that Hugo Black, the Supreme Court Justice, was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Wow. And he did that by going down and talking to the head of the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama about chickens. So he won him over. They're both chicken farmers.
God.
And so the guy, you know, sort of outed Hugo Black. But he did another piece, another series of stories for which he did not get adequate recognition that I think is even a greater achievement.
Yeah, that story was fascinating because many people are aware of a well-known account of a white person who passed as a black person for a while in order to do an investigative article. But Sprigle went further than that.
Yeah, you're thinking of Black Like Me by John Howard Griffin, I think.
Correct.
Because so many of us, I read it in high school, so many people read that about 1960. But Sprigle did something even harder that got almost no recognition. Sprigle went and lived as a black man in this deep Jim Crow South in 1948. Now, Sprigle was a man whose complexion was about the same as mine. And John Howard Griffin managed to dye his skin. Sprigle couldn't. He tried various things, almost killed himself. And then the head of the NAACP told him, Ray, it isn't how you look, it's how you act. And he basically, literally, was taught how to act as a subservient Southern Negro. And he went down there, passed for black, partly because why would anyone want to be black who wasn't black? Nobody ever really questioned. They just figured he was a light-skinned Negro, and wrote this 20-some article series about the searing, horrible things he found, turned it into a book, and he should have won the Pulitzer Prize for it. But it was sabotaged. We know it was deliberately sabotaged by a Southern editor who didn't want his region tarnished. He was actually a liberal Southern editor named Harding Carter, but he didn't want anything tarnishing the South's great reputation. Wow. And so Sprigle really sort of got the shaft in this when his reporting was much deeper than John Howard Griffin, and it really could have gotten him killed.
Well, but is there, I'm not familiar with whether or not it's possible to get a posthumous Pulitzer Prize.
It's never happened, but we're sort of a couple of experts. I've talked to some people. There's a man who wrote a biography of Sprigle. There's a very prominent newspaper editor who says this is the time to do it. And so we're sort of looking into that, and it certainly would be very justified. To show you how ironic life is, Bill, and you know this better than anybody, Sprigle did he covered the Blitz in London. He snuck into insane asylums. He went down unsafe coal mines. He did all this. And then years later, he was doing some routine work in his office on a Saturday, took a cab home, and was killed by a driver who splashed into the cab. Oh my God. It's, life isn't fair, as they say. But he was really, these stories are more fascinating than I'm able to describe here. If you have a chance to read the book, I think you'll see some of them.
Well, speaking of that, when is the book officially going to be available, and how will people be able to get it? Are you going to be doing any speaking, or is the book going to be made available to libraries in Ohio and Pennsylvania, for example?
I think anybody who wants it. We have the book. The book is printed. Distribution's a problem. We're in the process. I think by early February, this book is going to be available on Amazon. It should be available in some bookstores. And if somebody wants to send, if somebody's looking at this, if you're on Facebook, you can send me a message. You go to my blog, which is Lessenberry Inc., I-N-K, like ink pen,
Right.
not I-N-C. I don't have enough money to be an I-N-C. Inc.com, send me a message and I'll tell you a way to get it. But I'm happy to speak about it because, you know, race relations are so important today. And the thing that gratifies me the most is I've sent advance copies to a lot of African American folks who I know who've helped me. And their reaction has been universally positive.
Excellent.
And I mean, people say, well, there's a niggle here and there, but they really liked it, really liked the fact that their contributions are being highlighted that nobody had ever done before.
Well, you and I are each holding a hardcover, case-bound
Right.
copy with a jacket, but it's also available in a paperback edition and in a digital ebook edition.
I think so. Yeah, I know I have the paperback. I think the ebook. There's a nice section of colored pictures. If you can see, actually, there's Spriggle himself with his corncob pipe on a booklet. They reprinted all these stories he did about life in the Deep South, and you wonder. You read these things, you wonder how that ever happened in America, how he ever endured these sort of things. But Spriggle, by the way, he was no political crusader. In fact, he was a conservative Republican. He just felt that this was unfair. It was a good story. It was something that was unfair, and he ought to expose it.
Well, investigative journalism is something that's dear to my heart and has been to yours for years, and current events are proving it's alive and well. But when Spriggle did this, what year was this, in the 40s or 50s?
1948.
48.
The Civil Rights Revolution hadn't really even started yet. I mean, Brown versus Board of Education was 6 years away. Segregation was totally legal. In most states of the Union, I don't know about most states of the Union, at least 17 states of the Union, it was illegal for black people to marry white people, and they were really second-class citizens, and nobody really questioned that.
Yeah, they just, yeah. Well, of course, we have a major chapter, many of them actually, but one that comes to mind, of course, is the riots in 1967 in Detroit.
Exactly.
That shed a lot of light on the imbalances and inequities. Now, do you have in mind then taking the next step? You mentioned it would make a terrific story, it really would. You have to wonder if a documentary filmmaker or a feature filmmaker would not have an interest in a book like this. You know, Magic Johnson has his production company and others who have a special sensitivity and an interest.
That's true. Stanley Nelson, the great black filmmaker, did the best ever documentary. One of the best documentaries I've ever seen in my life is called Soldiers Without Swords. It's a history of the black press, came out about 1999. In fact, some of the experts in his documentary helped me with my book, who I called The Ones Who Were Still Alive. But I think, especially, the Spriggle story is a movie. I mean, this guy, in the case of Hugo Black, he ended up smuggling, having this Klan leader, he gave him a free trip to New York, and he smuggled these documents wrapped in his wife's underwear. And all sorts of funny, crazy stuff like that.
Well, our old mutual friend Elmore Leonard, who wrote 45 novels or so.
Right.
Who, by the way, if Dutch were around these days, I would like to have him in for a conversation.
Oh, for sure.
But he was frustrated about his books. His first half a dozen books that were converted into movies were dreadful. He couldn't even watch them himself until finally, toward the end, the series Justified and Get Shorty and a couple of others he was pleased with. But he would see this book, and I think the same way that I do, that there's a real story here for either television or motion picture.
There's material for a novel for sure, and the tragedy partly of Spriggle was that the country just wasn't ready. They weren't ready yet to really take this on. A lot of papers reprinted it, no Southern papers, and he wrote a book, 30 Days in the Land of Jim Crow, but it sort of sunk like a stone.
Yeah. Well, incredible. This is a fascinating story that you've gotten yourself into here. I imagine when you began on this and took the assignment on, I doubt that you had really a full awareness of just how rich of the story, and that it was of interest and will be to readers far beyond the borders of Ohio and Pennsylvania.
Bill, as you know, when you write books, you enrich yourself in ways you never imagined. You never imagined you learn things, and so many people helped me along the way. I found out, by the way, there's a man who wrote a book on Spriggle. I got it, read it, called him up. He said, "Come on down." I went to Pennsylvania. He took me all through Pittsburgh, showed me everything. Immense help, and
Yeah.
I learned so many things, and I learned so many things about the accomplishments and achievements of African Americans and African American journalists who, against great odds, still managed to be voices for truth and document their stories, and
Yes.
And it was very inspiring.
Well, yes, yeah. As somebody who's written a book or two myself, I know that you have to do it, but you can't do it without a lot of people giving you help along the way. Jack, this is a book that sheds light on racism and how an important newspaper family has, over the course of a century, handled very delicate issues of race, and the Spriggle story being just one fascinating piece of investigative journalism. I hope that people will take you up on your offer, our viewers, to look up Jack Lessenberry Inc., which I do regularly, and get in touch with Jack if you're interested in finding out where you can get the book, how you can get it. And I want to thank our viewers for joining in on this conversation. And I'd like to invite them to suggest topics and possible future guests for our conversations. And you can send an email to the studio here at the Clarkston High School, our independent television station. And we'll have a look at those and see what we can do about setting up a next conversation with one of our interesting guests. Thanks very much for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you for that conversation not long from now. Thank you.